The Death of a King and the Unnatural Request to Madrid. 1834. The bells of the city toll in muted rhythm, not in joyous peal, but in somber announcement: the king is dead. The corridors of the royal palace are hushed, though not silent. Whispers float through the thick air: the king is gone. But his shadow lingers. You are the royal physician, summoned once more to Ferdinand VII's chambers. The king lies stretched upon his bed, face waxing, lips drawn into the same cruel curve they had held in life. The scent of illness still clings to the sheets, mingled now with the cloying sweetness of incense burned for the dead. But it is not him you are here for. Not this time. Q had been called to his chamber, yes, but not for a diagnosis, not to ease a final fever, not to prepare a prayer at his bedside. He is beyond your craft. Instead, in the flickering gloom, stands Queen Regent Maria Cristina. Her cheeks are pale, her eyes swollen and red from tears. But her posture is iron, unbending. Her words strike harder than any blow. What she asks of you is not customary, not medical, not even moral. She requests the preservation of the king's most infamous feature, his grotesque deformity. It's the mark that whispered through courts and embassies for decades, but never dared touch the official record. You hesitate. Your gaze flicks to the lifeless figure. Even in death, Ferdinand VII seems to mock you, his heavy eyelids half closed, as if amused by this macabre task. Beneath the sheets lies the truth of it, not the twisted paranoia that consumed his reign, not the cruelty with which he ruled his wives and his people, but the physical aberration that haunted him since youth. The queen's voice is low but firm, command hidden beneath grief. She will not explain why. Perhaps it is to hold proof against whispers of illegitimacy, perhaps to lock away the evidence that had cursed his reign, or perhaps some dark corner of your mind wonders it is superstition, the belief that power resides in the relic of flesh, a talisman of kingship to be hidden from the world. Your hands tremble. You think of the palace corridors echoing with the screams of his brides, of custom-made cushions and medical contraptions that turned marital beds into instruments of torture. You remember the gossipette first dismissed as cruel exaggerations of a monstrous anatomy that broke bodies and shattered lives. Faced with the reality of it, you feel the weight of history pressing on your shoulders. To preserve such a thing is not medicine. It is ritual, a dark kind of embalming. Yet refusal is impossible. In this palace, refusal could mean ruin. And so you steady yourself for the task. Outside the chamber, Madrid is restless. The city suffers not only from mourning, but from hunger, from political strife, from cholera that has swept through the streets in waves. Ferdinand's death does not free Spain, it destabilizes it. Crowds gather in the plazas, murmuring of succession, of hope, of fear. But inside this gilded cage, history pivots on something far stranger: the preservation of a deformity, a relic of shame that embodies the grotesque marriage of body enthroned. As you ready your instruments, the chamber feels colder. The crucifix above the bed casts its shadow across the sheets. You wonder if God looks upon this act with pity or disgust, perhaps both. This is not simply the end of a reign. It is the beginning of a story long hidden in whispers and buried in shadows. The story of a king whose body betrayed him, and of a nation that suffered beneath his obsession with what lay beneath those sheets. And so you take a breath, steel your hands, and prepare to preserve not just flesh, but a singular, monstrous relic that, even in death, commands fear. The blood curse of Spain to understand Ferdinand VII. You must begin not with the man, but with the blood that coursed through his veins. It was not blood of vigor or destiny, but of centuries of dangerous unions, marriages, contracted not for love, not even for politics in the broader sense, but for the narrow preservation of dynastic power. The Spanish Bourbons and Habsburgs had spent generations wedded to their own reflections, toning cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, brothers to sisters, in a pattern so relentless it seemed less like marriage and more like a curse. Spain was not alone in this habit to rops. Thrones were littered with inbred monarchs. The Spanish line had taken it to its most perilous extreme. By the 18th century, the dynasty's inheritance was not glory, but fragility. It was etched on their faces and carved into their bones. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a jutting deformity, had already become a grotesque emblem of their pride. Charles II, Ferdinand's great-uncle, had been so riddled with genetic maladies that he could barely speak, let alone rule. His body was a battlefield of defects, his infertility the dynasty's death knell, and yet the cycle continued. On October 14, 1784, Ferdinand was born in El Escorial, the monastery palace outside Madrid that once stood as a symbol of Spain's imperial might. His parents were Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, first cousins, bound by duty and tradition. The genetic dice had been rolled for centuries, and with Ferdinand, they came up snake eyes. At first, nothing appeared unusual. He was a solemn infant, pale but strong enough to survive. But as he grew, the signs emerged not only of a strange, unsettling anatomy, but of the fragility of mind that would one day consume him. His body, his very existence, bore the imprint of choices made generations before. When power had been valued over health, and purity of blood over the survival of the line, this was not divine punishment, though some whispered it so. It was mathematics, written in flesh, the narrowing of a gene pool until nature struck back. To modern eyes, the tragedy is clear. Centuries of consanguinity had produced a ruler as malformed within as without. But to the courtiers of Ferdinand's day, the whispers spoke of scandal, of sin, of monstrous fate, and in the candlelit corridors of Madrid, the gossip grew. Even as a boy, Ferdinand was marked. Strangeness was no mere quirk, it was destiny. Its bloodline, like Spain itself, was unraveling. Spain's empire, once the jewel of the world, was already fractured. The colonies and the Americas strained against the crown, the treasury drained by war, the people starved, while aristocrats played at politics. In such a kingdom, the health of the royal line mattered more than ever. And yet, here was Ferdinand, a boy whose very body was both crowned and cursed by adolescence. Callous physicians could no longer dismiss the rumors as exaggerations. What he carried was not simply large, but grotesque, and with it, the promise of future humiliation. His reign was still decades away, but already the seeds of disaster had been sown, his blood in his body. In the cruel lottery of royal lineage, Spain had gambled on its kings for centuries. With Ferdinand, it had lost. A body betrays its prince. Ferdinand's childhood unfolded under the heavy tapestries and cold marble of Spain's royal palaces. But no wealth or ceremony could disguise the unease that followed him. At first, his tutors and attendants chalked up his awkward growth to the natural clumsiness of adolescence. He was a solemn boy, quiet and watchful, already prone to suspicion. Yet, as he neared adolescence, whispers began to circulate, not about his manners or his intellect, but about his body. The royal physicians were the first to notice. At an age when most boys struggled only with pimples or voice cracks, Ferdinand presented something far stranger. The accounts that survived private notes smuggled into archives. Fragments of correspondence never meant for the public eye describe. His anatomy in language that vacillates between clinical detachment and horrified fascination. One physician wrote with almost apologetic formality, His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove difficult. Another abandoning delicacy altogether, scrawled in frustration. It is like a billiard cue and at the root, thick as a fist at the end, and long enough to use as a cane. These were not the envious mutterings of rivals, nor vulgar exaggerations. They were sober reports of men whose profession was to heal, but who now stood before a mystery of flesh. And in Ferdinand's world, size was not a symbol of virility, but of monstrosity. The classical ideals so admired across Europe held moderation and proportion as the marks of masculine beauty. Greek statues did not exaggerate, they refined, sculpting the body into a balanced whole. By contrast, Ferdinand's deformity branded him a freak, a living violation of proportion. The cruel irony was that in a court obsessed with appearances, where portraits were touched up to flatter even the ugliest monarch, Ferdinand could not hide what was hidden beneath his robes. He knew it. He saw the glances, heard the whispers. His deformity was a secret, yet somehow it was always present, as if his shame radiated outward, sensed by those around him. His father, King Charles IV, was no comfort. Charles was an absent figure, more interested in hunting than governing, and when he did appear, he treated his son with indifference. His mother, Queen Maria Louisa, was worse brazen in her affair with Manuel de Gado. The powerful prime minister she flaunted like a consort. Ferdinand grew up in a household where betrayal was daily bread, where the very people meant to guide him exposed him instead to mockery and humiliation. Against this backdrop, his body's betrayal became unbearable. The servants snickered behind closed doors. Envoys rode back to their courts with veiled hints of something unnatural in the prince. Foreign dignitaries, trained to notice weaknesses, catalogued every oddity. The royal court, always a theater of intrigue, made Ferdinand its cruelest comedy. Imagine the isolation. A boy born to rule, yet made into a punchline. Every glance became a threat, every whisper a weapon. He learned early that his shame was both sacred and dangerous. To reveal it was to give others power over him. To mock it was to invite his rage. And so the boy hardened, teeth the velvet. In ceremony, he began to cultivate the traits that would define his reign: vindictiveness, cruelty, and an obsession with control. If he could not master his own body, he would master those around him. If his flesh mocked him, he would make others fear him enough to stop laughing. The deformity was not just a physical curse. It was the crucible in which his character was forged. And as he moved from adolescence toward manhood, Ferdinand VII became less a prince in waiting than a storm gathering on Spain's horizon. Shame in the palace was gilded, yes, but its walls carried secrets like damp stone holds mold. For Ferdinand, every hallway was a gauntlet. Every gesture, every stifled laugh, every fleeting glance could be interpreted as mockery. Often, it was by his teenage years. His body's abnormality was an open secret. The servants who dressed him and bathed him saw it plainly. Some recoiled in disgust, others in cruel amusement. Whispers slipped through locked doors, down the corridors, across the city. Even foreign ambassadors, keen observers of weakness, sent coded reports home. Ferdinand was not only awkward and suspicious, they hinted, but deformed. This ridicule might have been survivable had he been raised in a household of stability and support. But his family life was a theater of betrayal. His father, King Charles, preferred his hunting lodges and his falcons to the rigors of kingship. His mother, Queen Maria Louisa, made no effort to conceal her long-standing liaison with Manuel de Godoy, the prime minister. She paraded her affair through the palace with a brazenness that scandalized Spain but delighted her enemies. In paintings, in court rumors alike, Godoy was depicted as more kingly than the king himself, a man who had cuckolded the crown while simultaneously ruling in its stead. And Ferdinand, the neglected heir, was left to watch. He saw his father humiliated, his mother flaunting a lover, and he himself became the butt of jokes. Court life in Madrid was merciless. Gossip was a political weapon, laughter a dagger. If the boy walked into a room, conversations faltered. If he stumbled in a dance, titters followed. His deformity gave every rival, every servant, every sycophant a secret advantage. The Spanish court of the late 18th century was notorious for cruelty masquerading as wit. Mockery was not idle, it was strategy. To survive there required either thick skin or ruthless reprisal. Ferdinand had the latter. Each humiliation was stored away, a wound that festered into bitterness. He would learn to wield power, not as a duty, but as a weapon, the only shield against his shame. One can imagine the psychological prison. A prince born with a crown already promised, but with a body that denied him dignity. The young Ferdinand learned quickly that to be vulnerable was to invite ruin. He cultivated a mask of severity, punishing even imagined slights, projecting cold authority long before he sat on the throne. But beneath the mask, he was still the mocked boy, the boy whose body had betrayed him, whose family had betrayed him. His court would never let him forget what lay beneath his clothes. The cruel laughter of the palace did not fade with time. It echoed in him, and would echo in every decision he later made as king. In those early years, long before Ferdinand VII became infamous for paranoia and tyranny, he was already being shaped by the palace's silent chorus of shame. Spain thought it was laughing at a boy. It was, in truth, forging a tyrant. Fear and punishment. If Ferdinand had one lesson burned into him during adolescence, it was this: his shame must never be exposed. What began as whispers in the palace hardened into a kind of sacred terror, a taboo enforced not by reverence, but by cruelty. By his late teenage years, Ferdinand was no longer the helpless boy mocked by servants. He had learned that fear could be his ally. If his body betrayed him, then terror would protect him. Anyone who glimpsed his deformity, intentionally or not, would be made to pay the price. A court chaplain recorded one such episode in hushed tones, as though writing down a sin. A young page boy, no older than 14, wandered into Ferdinand's chambers at the wrong moment. He had been sent to deliver a letter, but instead he stumbled into the air while he was changing. The boy froze, horrified at what he saw. Ferdinand's reaction was swift and merciless. The page was flogged in public, his family exiled from Madrid within days. The message was clear: the prince's body was not to be seen, not to be spoken of. To acknowledge it was to risk ruin. In this way, Ferdinand's shame became weaponized. His deformity was no longer just a private affliction, it became a secret, guarded with punishments more severe than treason. Spanish notion of honor, deeply ingrained in its culture, intensified this obsession. To be dishonored in Spain was worse than death. For Ferdinand, honor and shame revolved entirely around his body. Protecting it meant protecting his very existence. The Catholic Church, too, cast a long shadow. Spain in the late 18th century was still a society where confession, sin, and secrecy intertwined. Nakedness itself carried moral weight, and deformity could easily be whispered about as a sign of divine judgment. Ferdinand absorbed this atmosphere like a sponge. To him, his deformity was not only humiliating, but potentially damning, mark that others might read as God's punishment. He would not allow them that power. Thus, he grew crueler. Servants whispered less often, not because the gossip had stopped, but because fear silenced them. Letters were intercepted, conversations monitored. Even in youth, Ferdinand displayed the paranoid vigilance that would later define his reign. No one, not even family, was trusted. In many ways, his adolescence was a testing ground for the two. Despot he would become. His shame was the seed, but punishment was the soil. Humiliation could not be erased. It could, at least, be avenged. And Ferdinand long before he wore the crown, began ruling through fear, starting with those unfortunate enough to glimpse the secret he could never escape. Spain was still decades from his kingship, but already its future was taking shape in the shadow of a young man's paranoia. He would not be laughed at again. He would be feared. The grooming of a tyrant as Ferdinand edged into adulthood. His deformity had already forged his character into something cold and suspicious, but circumstance added more fuel to the fire. The court of Charles IV was a stage of humiliation, and Ferdinand, forced to watch it daily, learned lessons not from kingship, but from betrayal. His father, weak-willed and passive, spent more time hunting boars than governing Spain. His mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, held the real authority, but through her lover. Manuel de Godoy, the son of minor nobility, had risen meteorically to become prime minister, generalissimo, and duke, but in the eyes of many, he was something more scandalous, the queen's paramour, her shadow king. For Ferdinand, this arrangement was intolerable. Imagine it, the heir to the Spanish throne forced to endure the sight of his mother parading her lover before courtiers, foreign ambassadors, even in official portraits. His father humiliated, his own claim undermined his family's dignity. Dragged through the streets of Madrid, where honor was already fragile for him, here it was shattered outright. Worse still, Godoy was everything Ferdinand was not: tall, handsome, charismatic, and shamelessly virile. Women adored him, men envied him, and the queen herself was devoted. If Ferdinand's deformity was his curse, then Godoy's allure was the cruelest contrast, a daily reminder that Ferdinand's body was not a source of power, but of shame. It is no wonder, then, that Ferdinand grew into a man of festering hatred. Hatred of Godoy, whom he blamed for his misery. Hatred of his mother, whose flaunted affair mocked the very idea of royal dignity. Hatred of his father, whose passivity seemed cowardice. Hatred, finally, of the courtiers, the servants, the entire palace that had once laughed at him. But hatred alone does not make a tyrant. Intrigue completes the transformation. And intrigue soon arrived in the form of Europe's most dangerous man, Napoleon Bonaparte, by the early 1800s. Spain was crumbling under the weight of its own misrule. The treasury was bankrupt, the colonies restless, the people hungry for toys. Alliance with France had pulled Spain into costly wars, earning him deep resentment. Napoleon saw opportunity in Spain's instability. Ferdinand saw opportunity in Napoleon. The young prince secretly conspired with French envoys, hoping to secure Napoleon's support to overthrow Godoy and sideline his parents. He dreamed of becoming king, not through the natural passing of the crown, but through a coup born of his own machinations. Here was the irony. The boy mocked for his body had grown, into a man willing to gamble a kingdom just to silence his humiliation. In 1807, the conspiracy known as the Conspiration de l'Escorial was discovered. Ferdinand's own letters to Napoleon were seized. For a moment, he seemed doomed, caught in the act of treason against his father. But Charles IV, terrified of exposing the rot in public, chose to hush the scandal. Ferdinand was pardoned, though never forgiven. The lesson Ferdinand absorbed was clear. Treachery was survivable. In fact, treachery worked. He had tested the limits of loyalty, and nothing had broken. By the time Spain collapsed into the chaos of Napoleonic invasion in 1808, Ferdinand VII was no longer the mocked, isolated boy. It was something far more dangerous, a man who believed himself both persecuted and chosen. A man for whom every slight demanded vengeance. A man whose private shame had metastasized into political ruthlessness. The boy shaped by whispers in the palace was now ready to rule, not with wisdom, not with dignity, but with paranoia sharpened into tyranny. Spain would pay the price. The People's Prince, when Spain finally erupted in 1808. Ferdinand's moment arrived. The royal family, his weak father, Charles IV, his brazen mother, Maria Louisa, and the detested Godoy had fled Madrid in panic after riots broke out. The people, sick of Godoy's corruption and Spain's humiliating dependence on France, surged through the streets, shouting a single name: Fernando. Fernando. For the first time in his life, Ferdinand was not mocked, not whispered about, not pitied. He was adored. Crowds hailed him as the savior of Spain, the antidote to his father's weakness and Godoy's decadence. The deformity that haunted him in the palace was invisible to the masses. They saw only a young prince, stern-faced, silent, and apparently incorruptible. His awkwardness, which courtiers had once mocked, now seemed to the common folk like solemn dignity. His paranoia looked like vigilance, his bitterness like resolve. In short, Ferdinand's flaws became his mask, and behind that mask became a legend. The irony was brutal. The very qualities forged by his humiliation, suspicion, secrecy, cruelty were now interpreted as strength. The people projected onto Ferdinand the virtues they longed for. They wanted a king who was not controlled by France, not corrupted by Godoy, not humiliated like Charles IV. They wanted a savior. And Ferdinand, desperate to be loved, played this role to perfection when Charles IV was forced to abdicate in March 1808. The crown passed to Ferdinand VII. His triumph seemed absolute. The boy who had been ridiculed in candlelit corridors was now hailed as El Decido, the desired one. But destiny, once again, would mock him, for Napoleon had other plans. The French emperor invited Ferdinand to Bayonne under the guise of negotiation. Naive or arrogant, Ferdinand went. There, in a velvet-draped trap, he was forced to abdicate in favor of Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Within weeks of tasting glory, Ferdinand was a prisoner, first in France, then in exile, and yet even in absence, his legend only grew. Spain rose not for Joseph, not for Charles, not for Godoy, but for Ferdinand. Guerrilla fighters scrawled his name on banners. Cities in rebellion invoked him as their rightful sovereign. He was everywhere, even as he languished under house arrest in France. The irony was unbearable. Ferdinand was worshipped by his people precisely when he was powerless. They saw him as the embodiment of Spanish resistance, a martyr king standing against tyranny. In truth, he sat idly in Napoleon's custody, brooding, waiting, festering. But myths are stronger than men. And when, at last, in 1814, Napoleon fell, and Ferdinand returned to Spain, he was greeted with the delirium of joy. The streets of Madrid overflowed. Bells rang, church choirs sang, peasants wept at his feet. He had been absent for 6 years, but absence had made him divine. The boy once mocked as monstrous was now El Decido. Spain believed it was welcoming back a savior. What they did not yet know was that the prince, shaped by shame, fear, and cruelty, was about to become one of the most ruthless tyrants in Spanish history. Return of the desired 1 April 1814. Ferdinand VII returned to Spain as if he were Christ risen. The road swelled with peasants and nobles alike, kneeling as his carriage passed. Bells rang in every village, choirs sang, crowds screamed themselves, hoarse with a single cry: Viva Fernando el Decido! Long live Ferdinand, the desired. After 6 years of absence, he was not just a king. He was a myth. To the people, he was the embodiment of resistance. The rightful monarch, cruelly caged by Napoleon, the savior who would restore Spain's honor. Even the Cortes of Cadiz, who had governed in his absence, imagined Ferdinand would embrace them as patriots who preserved his kingdom. But Ferdinand had returned not as a savior, but as a scarred, suspicious man. His years in captivity had not mellowed him. They had sharpened his paranoia, deepened his bitterness. Surrounded by flattery, isolated from reality, he convinced himself that he was not merely king by law, but king by divine right, chosen by God and sanctified by suffering. The truth was crueler still. While Spain had bled and starved under war, while guerrillas died invoking his name, Ferdinand had done nothing. He had languished in comfort under French custody, passive and bitter. Yet, because absence breeds fantasy, the people mistook his silence for stoicism, his idleness for martyrdom. The Cortes had drafted the liberal Constitution of 1812, the Constitution of Cadiz, called La Pepa, bold charter, promising national sovereignty, freedom of the press, limits on royal power. It was Spain's great leap toward modernity, born in the fire of war. The deputies believed Ferdinand, welcomed as a hero, would crown their work with his approval. They misjudged him fatally on his way to Madrid. Ferdinand received a manifesto, the Manifesto of the Persians, signed by reactionary nobles and clergy, begging him to abolish the constitution and restore absolute monarchy. This was all he needed. When he entered the capital, the crowds roared for him. He smiled, bowed slightly, let them worship. Then, with one stroke of the pen, he destroyed their dream. He abolished the constitution, dissolved the Cortes, and declared absolute monarchy restored. The betrayal was staggering. Overnight, the savior became the jailer. Those who had fought in his name were imprisoned. Deputies of Cadiz were exiled, hunted, silenced. Printing presses were smashed. Newspapers shuttered. The Inquisition, abolished by the liberals, flickered back to life. It was as if Spain had fought 6 bloody years of war, not to escape tyranny, but to deliver itself into its most paranoid and vindictive form. And Ferdinand ruled as he always had lived, through suspicion, vengeance, and fear. He saw enemies everywhere, liberals, soldiers, peasants, even family. He could forgive nothing, trust no one. The mockery of his youth still echoed in him. And now he possessed a throne from which to punish. Spain had longed for El Decido. But what they received was a king molded by shame and cruelty. And as the years stretched on, Ferdinand VII would prove himself not the savior of Spain, but its tormentor. The tyranny of the desired 1814 to 1820 Ferdinand VII had returned as a god, a teach, and within weeks he ruled as a tyrant. His first act abolishing the Constitution of Cadiz was not a misstep of politics, but a declaration of war upon his own people. He had been crowned by their love, and he answered with iron. The repression began immediately. Deputies who had drafted the Constitution were arrested in their homes at dawn. Some were imprisoned in dungeons, others shipped to colonies as exiles, a few quietly executed under fabricated charges. The Inquisition, abolished by the liberals, flickered back to life like a ghost, dragging heretics and reformers into its net. Ferdinand did not stop at politics. He hunted ideas. Printing presses were smashed, books burned, newspapers shuttered. Informants slithered through Madrid's taverns, listening for treasonous talk. A joke, a rumor, a sigh could be enough to bring the secret police to your door. The prisons filled quickly monks who had preached reform, officers who had sworn to the Constitution, students who had shouted freedom too loudly in the plaza. Entire families were ruined, their estates confiscated, their names blotted from honor. Spain, exhausted by 6 years of Napoleonic war, found itself living under a domestic terror as suffocating as any foreign occupation. Ferdinand ruled like a man convinced that even shadows plotted against him, and in a sense, he was right. Hist. Paranoia created conspiracies where none had existed, but it also birthed real conspiracies. Soldiers who had fought in the Guerra de Independencia now whispered of rebellion. Secret societies multiplied in taverns and Masonic lodges. Exiled liberals in London and Paris published pamphlets calling Ferdinand a tyrant and urging Spaniards to rise. Yet, Ferdinand clung to power with the same instinct that had protected him since childhood: punish, silence, terrify. He had never learned to lead through trust or respect. He had learned only to destroy those who might mock or betray him. Spain withered. The colonies in America, neglected and disillusioned, erupted in revolt. Argentina, Mexico, Colombia all slipped away, one after another, while Ferdinand obsessed over purges at home. The Spanish Empire was crumbling, but the king remained fixated on enemies in Madrid coffeehouses. Still, for a time, he succeeded. His cruelty kept him on the throne. But cruelty cannot silence hunger, nor fear smother forever the desire for freedom. By 1820, the pressure of repression, bankruptcy, and colonial collapse reached its breaking point. It came not from intellectuals or politicians, but from soldiers and army meant to sail to the Americas, mutinied instead, demanding the restoration of the Constitution of Cadiz. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Ferdinand, the master of terror, suddenly found terror turned against him. Cornered, he did what he always had done when survival was at stake. He yielded with false smiles. On March 9, 1820, Ferdinand appeared before the people of Madrid and, with theatrical piety, swore upon the constitution he had once burned. Marquimos, francamente, yo el primero, por la senda constitutional. Let us march frankly, I ain't, along the constitutional path. It was a lie, a mask, a performance of submission from a king who despised nothing more than the Constitution itself. Thus began the liberal triennium, 1822-1823, 3 years, in which Ferdinand pretended to accept constitutional monarchy, all the while scheming for revenge. The liberal triennium, 1822-1823, Ferdinand VII swore upon the Constitution with one hand, while sharpening his dagger with the other. His words in March 1820, "I will march upon the constitutional path," were delivered with theatrical solemnity before roaring crowds. But those who knew the king, who had seen him betray, lie, and punish since boyhood, recognized the performance for what it was: survival. Ferdinand accepted the Constitution, not out of conviction, but because the army had left him no choice. Thus began the Triennial Liberal. 3 years of an easy compromise between a Spain thirsting for liberty and a king thirsting for vengeance. At first, the atmosphere in Madrid was electric. Newspapers sprang back to life. Pamphlets flooded the streets. Cafes buzzed with debates, once whispered only in secret lodges. Students marched with banners proclaiming "Viva la Constitution," while exiles returned from London and Paris, greeted as heroes. For the first time in centuries, Spain seemed to step into the light of modern politics, but Ferdinand loathed every second of it. He despised the deputies of the Cortes, whom he saw not as patriots, but as usurpers who dared to limit his divine right. He despised the freedom of the press, which mocked him openly after years of silence. He despised the soldiers who had forced his hand, and the crowds who cheered them. So he played the game of submission while secretly undermining the very order he pretended to uphold. Inside the palace, Ferdinand plotted. He flooded the army with loyalist officers, bribed generals, and whispered promises of restoration to conservative nobles and clergy. Priests thundered from pulpits that the Constitution was heresy, that liberals were Jacobin in disguise, that only the king's absolute power could preserve Spain's soul. Outside Spain, he begged for rescue. Letters flew across Europe to the Holy Alliance, Russia, Prussia, and above all, France. He painted himself as a martyr king imprisoned by radicals, pleading for Christian monarchs to deliver him from captivity. Meanwhile, within Spain, Ferdinand allowed chaos to grow. He encouraged riots, fueled divisions between moderates and radicals, and smiled as liberals fought among themselves. He was the spider at the center of a web, waiting for foreign steel to finish the job he could. Not by 1822. The mask was slipping. Madrid seethed with tension. Liberals rallied in the plazas. Absolutists rioted in churches. Conspiracies flourished in barracks. Assassination attempts erupted. The king himself nearly became the victim of a mob after it was revealed he had tried to flee the capital. Only the protection of the National Guard saved him soldiers who despised him, shielding him against his will. Finally, in 1823, salvation arrived not for Spain, but for Ferdinand. Across the Pyrenees marched 100,000 sons of St. Louis, a French army sent with the blessing of Europe's monarchs to restore absolute rule. Ferdinand greeted them as liberators, desired one who had sworn to lead Spain along the constitutional path now rode behind foreign bayonets. Eager to see his people crushed, the triennium ended in blood and betrayal. Liberal soldiers fought bravely, but were outmatched. The Cortes fled south with Ferdinand as their reluctant hostage, dragging him to Cadiz. But when the city fell, the king was rescued by the French. He emerged smiling, sanctified by his supposed ordeal. Once restored, Ferdinand wasted no time in revealing his true nature. He denounced every decree passed since 1820, imprisoned the deputies, executed generals, silenced presses, and unleashed vengeance upon the nation. The liberals had called him El Decido. Now he earned a darker title, El Rey Felon, the felon, king, the perjurer, the betrayer. Spain had gambled on liberty. Ferdinand had turned their hope into ash. The felon king, 1823 to 1833. Ferdinand VII returned to power in 1823, carried not by the will of his people, but by the bayonets of foreign soldiers. The French intervention had crushed the liberal experiment, and with it vanished the last illusions that Spain could be governed by consent. Now the mask came off. The king no longer pretended to be El Decido, the savior of the nation. He ruled instead as El Rey Felon, the felon king. His vengeance was merciless. Those who had stood with the Constitution were branded traitors. Generals who had fought for liberty were executed, some hanged in public squares, others shot by firing squads. Deputies of the Cortes were imprisoned, tortured, or forced into exile once again. The universities were purged, professors dismissed, students arrested, printers, shops were ransacked, presses melted down. Even whispers of dissent could end in chains. The prisons overflowed. The gallows worked without rest. Thousands fled abroad, intellectuals, officers, poets, journalists, pleading Spain of her most vital minds. A black silence settled over the country, enforced by informants and inquisitors. Ferdinand, ever paranoid, surrounded himself with priests and courtiers who flattered him as God's chosen sovereign. He ruled not with vision, but with suspicion. Ministers rose and fell at his whim, no policy lasting longer than his temper. Spain sank deeper into debt. Her colonies across the Atlantic now lost forever, while the king obsessed not over empire, but over plots against his crown, and always behind his cruelty lingered the mark of humiliation. The boy mocked for his deformity. The prince sneered at encandlelit corridors. As king, he turned that lifelong wound outward, punishing a nation as if it were the chorus of jeering voices from his youth. Yet, even in power, Ferdinand's throne was unstable. He had no son, and succession loomed like a storm. By law, his brother Don Carlos stood next in line. Carlos was the darling of absolutists, hard, pious, unyielding. But in 1830, Ferdinand stunned the court by issuing the pragmatic sanction, declaring that his daughter, the infant Isabel, would inherit the pay crown instead. This decision split Spain in two. To the liberals, Isabel offered a sliver of hope for reform under a regency. To the traditionalists, it was heresy, a violation of male succession, a betrayal of divine order. The seeds of civil war were sown, though Ferdinand himself seemed blind to what he had unleashed by the early 1830s. His body began to betray him as cruelly as his character had betrayed Spain. Obese, gout-ridden, half-paralyzed, Ferdinand became a grotesque figure. Wheeled through the palace like a swollen effigy, his face, once pale and stern, now sagged into folds of pain. But his malice burned on. He spent his final years lashing out in decrees, rearranging ministries, punishing enemies real and imagined. His court descended into a carnival of intrigue clergy, courtiers, and foreign ambassadors circling like vultures over a dying king. On the 29th of September, 1833, Ferdinand VII died, leaving behind a fractured Spain. His daughter, Isabel, only 3 years old, inherited a kingdom already in flames. His brother Carlos refused to accept her, and within weeks, Spain plunged into the First Carlist War, brutal civil conflict born directly from Ferdinand's decisions. Thus ended the reign of the desired one. He had returned from humiliation to wear the crown, only to wield it as an instrument of vengeance. He had been adored as savior, hated as tyrant, and mourned by few. Spain emerged from his reign weaker, poorer, and more divided than ever before. And Ferdinand himself, he remained to the very end. The boy mocked in whispers, forever wounded, forever cruel, forever feared, but never truly loved. This closes the arc of Ferdinand VII's life, said 84 to 1833, from deformed, humiliated prince to tyrant king, whose paranoia scarred a nation. Would you like me to now write an epilogue, summing up his legacy and how historians judge him today? Or should I stop here with the finality of his death?